Hello everyone, tonight we are drifting back, way back into the humid, hazy dawn of ancient Japan. Picture yourself standing in a vast, damp plain, the mist clinging to your rough-spun tunic like a needy ghost. It's quiet, almost too quiet, just the whisper of wind through tall reeds and the squelch of your worn sandals in the mud. This is long before the gleaming armor and perfectly crafted katana, long before the noble samurai even had a name. And honestly, given the general lack of antibiotics and reliable food sources, you probably won't survive this. It's a tough world out here, and we're just getting started on a very, very long story. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments below? It's always fascinating to see where everyone is drifting off from. Mine is a rather unglamorous office, and the time is, well, let's just say the coffee has long since worn off. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's go on our journey tonight. You're trudging through that mud, a thick, sucking mire that seems to coat everything in this early version of Japan. The air is heavy with the smell of damp earth, wood smoke from distant, unseen hearths, and the faint, musky scent of wild animals. Look around you. There are no grand castles, no bustling cities with neon signs advertising the latest sushi-flavored snack. Instead, you see small clusters of pit dwellings, their thatched roofs blending into the brown and green landscape. These are the homes of the early inhabitants, people whose lives are tied to the rhythm of the seasons, the success of the hunt, and the often unpredictable whims of nature and their neighbors. The concept of a samurai is centuries away, a distant dream. But there are warriors, of course. There have always been warriors. You might see them, small bands of men, their faces grim, their clothing practical rather than ornate. More akin to very serious farmers who've picked up sharp objects than the later, iconic figures. Their armor, if you can call it that, is likely hardened leather or perhaps a few crudely fashioned metal plates, probably looking less like fierce warrior and more like someone forgot to do laundry for a millennium and just put on whatever was stiffest. They carry straight, unrefined swords, not the elegant curved blades that will one day become synonymous with Japan. These early swords, known as chokuto, were often imported or based on Chinese and Korean designs, heavy and functional, designed for thrusting and hacking rather than the graceful slicing of later eras. Then a new sound ripples through the land, something that changes the very fabric of conflict and status, the thud of hooves. Horses. They weren't native to Japan, a canonical historical fact, being their arrival likely from the Korean peninsula around the 4th or 5th century CE during the Kofun period. Suddenly the battlefield, such as it was, tilted. A warrior on horseback could move fast to strike with greater force and survey the chaotic scene with a new perspective. Imagine seeing one for the first time, this large, powerful creature, an extension of the rider's will. It must have been terrifying or inspiring. These early mounted warriors weren't necessarily the disciplined cavalry units of later times. Historians still debate whether these early mounted warriors were primarily an elite fighting force set apart by their expensive equestrian gear, or if riding was more widespread among tribal chieftains for status and transport, a bit like owning the flashiest ox cart on the block. The horses themselves were probably smaller, stockier breeds than the thoroughbreds of today, perhaps a bit more like stubborn, shaggy ponies who had very strong opinions about charging into a group of spear-wielding adversaries. You can almost hear their internal monologue. "You want me to go? Where are you serious, mate?" The people of this era, often referred to as the Yayoi and succeeding Kofun period, folks were busy farming rice in those muddy paddies, busy forging iron tools, and yes, busy fighting. The land that would become Japan was a patchwork of clans, or uji, each with their own chieftains, their own ancestral spirits, and their own ambitions. Conflicts were likely skirmishes over resources land, or perhaps just a particularly bad Tuesday. These weren't grand campaigns for national unification. They were localized squabbles, brutal and personal. And in this era, before a strong central authority who was there to stop them, You might stumble upon a kofun, a massive keyhole-shaped burial mound, one of the defining features of this period. These weren't just graves, they were statements. The size and grandeur of a kofun spoke volumes about the power and influence of the chieftain buried within, along with their prized possessions, mirrors, beads, weapons, and sometimes rather charmingly, clay figures called haniwa. A quirky fact is that these haniwa weren't just of warriors or houses. They depicted animals, boats, musicians, and everyday scenes, giving us these little clay snapshots of life and the afterlife. Some of the warrior haniwa even show early forms of lamella armor, small plates laced together, the precursor to what would become samurai armor. The warriors of this time, these proto-samurai if you will, were deeply connected to their local deities, the kami, Shinto. The indigenous faith of Japan was taking shape, a belief system that found spirits in mountains, rivers, trees, and even particularly impressive rocks. Victory in battle wasn't just about skill or numbers, it was about securing the favor of these kami. Before a skirmish, you might see a warrior making offerings, performing rituals, trying to get the local spirits on their side. It was probably a bit more effective than hoping your dial-up connection to the war god was stable. As you wander, notice the fortifications or lack thereof. Grand stone castles are a much later development. Here, a village might be protected by a simple wooden palisade or an earthen embankment, perhaps a ditch. It's more of a polite suggestion to invaders than an impenetrable barrier. Warfare was fluid, often hit and run, relying on ambush and knowledge of the local terrain, that treacherous mud, those dense forests, the winding river valleys. The development of ironworking was also a game-changer, slowly replacing bronze for tools and weapons. Imagine the clang of the early smith's hammer, a sound echoing through the small settlements, forging the tools that would build a nation, and the weapons that would defend or contest its territories. These weren't master swordsmiths yet, but their work was vital. The quality of your spearhead or your arrow tip could mean the difference between a full belly and becoming well part of the landscape. So as the mists begin to swirl again, obscuring your view of these ancient muddy plains and the tough, unrefined warriors who roamed them, remember that this is where the story begins. Not with poetry and elaborate tea ceremonies, but with grit, with survival, and with the slow, steady beat of change, one muddy footstep, one reluctant horse at a time. The idea of a dedicated warrior class serving a master with unwavering loyalty is still just a faint stirring in the collective consciousness, a seed buried deep in the fertile, damp earth. The mists slowly recede and the damp, earthy smell of the plains gives way to something more complex. You find yourself drifting forward in time, the rough-hewn huts and muddy tracks gradually being replaced by more structured, though still predominantly wooden architecture. You've floated into the Heian period, a long stretch of Japanese history lasting from 794 to 1185 AD. The imperial court has moved to a new capital, Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility, which you'd know today as Kyoto. And peaceful it was, at least, within the gilded cage of the court. Imagine yourself now not slogging through mud, but perhaps gliding, an unseen observer, through the polished wooden corridors of a nobleman's residence. The air here is perfumed with incense, a subtle blend of sandalwood and rare blossoms. You hear the rustle of silk as courtiers, men and women, drift by in elaborate, multi-layered robes. Their faces are often powdered white, and for the ladies, their hair, impossibly long and glossy black, might trail behind them for several feet. It's all very elegant, very aesthetic, and let's be honest, probably a nightmare for laundry day. You can just imagine the dry cleaning bills. Life in Heian-kyo for the aristocracy revolved around refinement. Poetry competitions were a major pastime with intricate rules governing syllable counts and acceptable themes. Usually the beauty of nature, the sorrow of fleeting love, or the melancholic sigh of the autumn wind. Calligraphy was an art form as important as the words themselves. A poorly written poem, even with beautiful sentiment, was a social faux pas of epic proportions. Romance was conducted through elegantly penned notes passed discreetly by servants, often involving complex metaphors and layers of hidden meaning. It makes modern dating apps seem brutally straightforward, doesn't it? You up versus a 12-verse waka poem about the dew on a morning glory. While the nobles in the capital were busy perfecting their couplets and worrying about whether the shade of their sixth robe layer clashed with the fifth out in the provinces, things were a bit more robust. The central government's control over the outlying regions was often tenuous. Wealthy landowners and provincial nobles, often distant relatives of the imperial family or cadet branches of powerful clans, began to accumulate power and land. And to protect that land and to enforce their will, they needed men who were good with more than just a calligraphy brush. Enter the bushi or warrior. This is the term that begins to describe the emerging martial class, the ancestors of the samurai. These weren't the courtiers in their silken robes. These were men of action, often from hardy landowning families, skilled in horsemanship and archery. While the emperor was the divine ruler and the Fujiwara clan pulled many of the strings behind the throne through strategic marriages and political maneuvering, the bushi were the ones getting their hands dirty. They suppressed rebellions, collected taxes, or sometimes resisted them, and generally kept a lid on things in the countryside, where imperial decrees often felt very far away. A canonical historical fact for you, the Heian period, despite its name, and the court's focus on aesthetics, was the crucible where the samurai class truly began to form. It wasn't a sudden revolution, but a slow shift in power, like a tide creeping in almost unnoticed until suddenly your picnic blanket is soaked. The court, increasingly isolated from the realities of provincial life, often outsourced military and police functions to these burgeoning warrior families. Oh, there's a spot of bother in Hitachi province. Send the Taira boys, they're good at that sort of thing. The weapons and armor of these early bushi were also evolving. The straight chokuto swords, like those muddy relics from before, were gradually being replaced by the iconic curved blade, the tachi. This curvature wasn't just for show. It made drawing the sword from horseback easier and was more effective for slashing attacks. Armor, too, was becoming more sophisticated. The oyoroi, or great armor, was a distinctive boxy style made of small plates of iron or leather called kozen, laced together with silk or leather cords in vibrant colors. It was designed primarily for mounted archery, offering protection while allowing the flexibility needed to use a bow from a moving horse. Imagine the thwack of the bowstring, the hiss of the arrow, a much more common sound on the provincial estates than the gentle plucking of a koto. And here's a quirky little fact from the Heian court to contrast with the rugged bushi. Many courtiers, both men and women, practiced ohaguro, the custom of blackening their teeth. It was considered a mark of beauty and maturity. While it might seem strange to us, beauty standards are, as we know, ever-changing. So while the provincial warrior might be checking the sharpness of his tachi, the courtier might be applying a fresh coat of iron filings and tea to their smile. Different priorities, different worlds existing side by side. Historians still debate whether the rise of the bushi was a direct result of imperial neglect, a sort of while the cat's away, the mice will play with swords scenario, or if it was a more organic development of regional power structures responding to local needs and opportunities. Perhaps it was a bit of both. The vast estates or shuin granted to nobles and temples often became semi-autonomous, and they needed their own protection rackets. Sorry, security forces, you can almost feel the subtle shift in the air. The scent of incense in Heian-kyo is still strong, but if you listen carefully beyond the poetry readings and the flute music, you might hear the distant clang of a smith's hammer in a provincial forge or the rhythmic shouts of warriors training in a dusty courtyard. The courtiers, in their pursuit of Miyabi courtly refinement, were inadvertently creating a power vacuum that the more pragmatic, martially inclined provincial families were only too happy to fill. They were, in a way, composing the epic poem of Japan's future, not with ink and brush, but with steel and sinew. The irony is, of course, that the refined culture they so cherished would eventually be preserved and even patronized by the very warrior class whose rise signaled the decline of their own direct political dominance. It's like spending all your time perfecting your sourdough starter while someone else is building the oven that will eventually bake everyone's bread. The sun begins to set over Heian-kyo, casting long shadows through the paper shoji screens. The poems are being written, the love affairs are blooming and wilting like cherry blossoms, but out in the darkening countryside the bushi are sharpening their skills, their loyalty tied more to their local lords and their own warrior codes than to the distant, perfumed court. The stage is being set for bigger dramas, for clashes that will involve more than just witty repartee. The balance of power is slowly, almost imperceptibly, tilting. The perfumed air of Heian-kyo begins to carry a metallic tang, a faint scent of blood and smoke that wasn't there before. The refined conversations in the capital are increasingly punctuated by anxious whispers about events in the provinces. The slow rise of the bushi has reached a tipping point, and two powerful warrior clans, the Taira, also known as the Heike, and the Minamoto or Genji, have become the dominant players, their rivalry escalating from polite disdain to outright bloody conflict. You're now trudging into the era of the Genpei War, a sprawling, messy and utterly transformative conflict that raged from 1180 to 1185. Forget the subtle poetry duels for a moment. This is a full-blown, nationwide family feud with Japan as the unfortunate backyard. The Taira had for a time managed to insinuate themselves into the heart of the imperial court, with Taira no Kiyomori effectively ruling, Japan even marrying his daughter to the emperor and placing his grandson on the throne. They became, in essence, the new courtiers, adopting some of the aristocratic airs they had once stood in contrast to. Perhaps they spent a bit too much time practicing their calligraphy and not enough time watching their backs, or maybe they just got a bit too comfortable with their newfound power, like someone who finally gets the comfiest chair and refuses to let anyone else even look at it. The Minamoto, on the other hand, had been largely exiled and weakened after earlier clashes, but they were biding their time, nursing their grievances and sharpening their swords, literally and metaphorically. The call to arms came from an imperial prince, Mochihito, who, fed up with Taira dominance, issued a decree for the Minamoto and other disgruntled warriors to rise up, and rise up they did. Imagine the scene, not just isolated skirmishes anymore, but armies on the move. Banners bearing the distinctive crests of the Taira, a stylized butterfly, and the Minamoto, the sasarindo, a bamboo and gentian flower design, flutter in the wind. Lines of mounted warriors, their yoroi armor, glinting their longbows or yumi at the ready. Foot soldiers, the ashigaru, armed with naginata, a polearm with a curved blade, brutally effective against cavalry if you knew how to use it, or against your own shins if you didn't, and spears marching alongside them. The dust kicked up by thousands of men and horses fills the air, mingling with the smoke of burning villages. This wasn't a war of quick, decisive battles, at least not initially. It was a grueling series of campaigns fought across Honshu and Kyushu, from the cold northern provinces to the warmer climes of the south. One of the early key figures for the Minamoto was Minamoto no Yoritomo. He was cunning, ruthless, and a brilliant organizer, establishing his headquarters in Kamakura, far from the intrigues of Kyoto, a strategic move that would have long-lasting consequences. His younger half-brother Minamoto no Yoshitsune, however, became the romantic hero of the war, a brilliant, almost preternaturally gifted tactician and warrior. Think of him as the dashing, swashbuckling action star, while Yoritomo was the grim-faced producer, making sure the budget didn't overrun too much. A canonical historical fact, the Battle of Dan-no-Ura in 1185, was the decisive naval engagement that ended the Genpei War. The Taira, outnumbered and outmaneuvered by Yoshitsune's forces, faced utter annihilation. In a tragic climax, the Lady Ni, grandmother of the child emperor Antoku, drowned herself and the young emperor, rather than be captured, taking the imperial regalia, the sacred sword, jewel and mirror, with her into the waves. Though the jewel and mirror were reportedly recovered, the sword Kusanagi no Tsurugi was said to be lost forever, a powerful symbol of the Taira's fall and the shifting tides of power. The war was characterized by incredible feats of heroism and equally incredible acts of brutality. Tales of individual combat between renowned warriors shouting their pedigrees across the battlefield before engaging in mortal duels became legendary. But it was also a war of scorched earth, of betrayals, and of immense suffering for the common people caught in the crossfire. Historians still debate whether the Genpei War was primarily a struggle for political supremacy between two clans, or if it represented a deeper societal shift, the final violent assertion of the warrior class over the declining aristocracy. Was it just a bigger, meaner version of a gang war or the birth pangs of a new feudal order? Now for a quirky fact, somewhat related to the chaos of the times during periods of instability, like the Genpei War, the production of counterfeit currency sometimes increased. With the central government weakened, unscrupulous individuals might try to mint their own coins, often of inferior quality. Imagine trying to pay for your war supplies with a dodgy batch of copper coins that are mostly lead. Probably didn't endear you to the local merchants. It's the medieval equivalent of someone trying to pay for a tank of gas with monopoly money. You can almost feel the exhaustion of the land itself. Years of conflict had taken their toll. Fields lay, fallow villages were plundered, and the delicate social fabric was torn. The elegant poetry of Heian Kyo seemed a distant memory, drowned out by the war cries and the lamentations of the defeated. The Minamoto victory was total. The Taira were decimated, their leaders killed or driven into hiding. But the victory came at a cost not just in lives but in the very nature of Japanese governance. Minamoto no Yoritomo, now the undisputed military power in Japan, wasn't interested in becoming another courtier in Kyoto playing dress-up and writing melancholic verse. He had seen how that lifestyle could lead to weakness and decay. He wanted a new system, one based on warrior loyalty and direct military control. The era of the refined but often ineffective imperial court was drawing to a close. The era of the bushi, hardened by war and led by a pragmatic, unyielding leader, was dawning. The salt spray from the straits of Shimonoseki, where the final battle of Dan-no-ura took place, seems to cling to you. The ghosts of drowned warriors and a child emperor haunt the waves. The glorious history of the ancient samurai is often portrayed with a focus on honor and skill, but the Genpei War reminds you that it was also forged in bitter rivalry, ruthless ambition, and the kind of widespread devastation that leaves scars on a nation's soul for generations. The mud and horses from those earliest days had given way to organized armies and strategic campaigns, but the fundamental human desires for power and dominance remained, now played out on a much grander and more tragic scale. The triumphant Minamoto banners are now waving over a landscape dramatically and permanently altered. The echoes of the Genpei War are still reverberating across the land, like the aftershocks of a great earthquake. The Taira are gone, shattered and dispersed, and Minamoto no Yoritomo stands as the most powerful man in Japan. But power, as you know, is a slippery thing. Grabbing it is one thing, holding on to it, and more importantly legitimizing it, is another challenge entirely. You're now entering the Kamakura period, named after Yoritomo's base of power, a coastal town far to the east of Kyoto, signaling a very deliberate shift away from the imperial capital's influence. Yoritomo, ever the pragmatist, wasn't about to make the same mistakes the Taira did by getting too cozy with the imperial court and its endless silken intrigues. He wanted a government run by warriors for warriors based on direct feudal ties of loyalty and service. In 1192, a date that often sticks in the minds of Japanese schoolchildren, the emperor, now largely a figurehead, granted Yoritomo the title of Sei Taishogun, which translates to something like Great Barbarian Subduing Generalissimo. It sounds rather grand, doesn't it? Like a title you'd give to someone who wrestles bears for a living. This marked the official beginning of the Kamakura shogunate, or bakufu, literally tent government harking back to the field headquarters of a general. So you've got two governments now, sort of. The imperial court still existed in Kyoto, full of nobles, still meticulously applying their makeup, Practicing their calligraphy and quietly lamenting the good old days, they handled ceremonial duties and maintained the illusion of imperial sovereignty. But the real political and military power that was now firmly entrenched in Kamakura with the shogun. It was a bit like having a very fancy, historically significant CEO who gives great speeches, but all the actual decisions are made by the no-nonsense COO working out of a much plainer office a few hundred miles away. The early years of the Kamakura shogunate were all about consolidation. Yoritomo was busy setting up the administrative machinery to govern the country. This involved appointing his loyal vassals as military governors, shugo, and estate stewards jito throughout the provinces. Their job was to maintain order, enforce the shogun's laws, and crucially ensure that taxes and dues flowed smoothly, preferably towards Kamakura. It was less about glorious charges on horseback and more about land surveys, tax registers, and ensuring your underlings weren't skimming too much off the top. The shift from warrior to administrator was beginning, though the sword was always kept sharp and close at hand. Now here's a canonical historical fact. After Yoritomo's rather sudden death in 1199, he reportedly fell off his horse, a somewhat anticlimactic end for such a dominant figure. His sons proved less capable. Power didn't stay with the Minamoto line for long. Instead, it gradually fell into the hands of Yoritomo's wife's family, the Hojo clan. Through astute political maneuvering and the establishment of the position of shikken or regent for the shogun, the Hojo effectively ruled Japan for over a century, even though the shoguns themselves were often young puppet figures from the Minamoto line, or even later imperial princes or court nobles. The Hojo never took the title of shogun for themselves, preferring to rule from behind the scenes. It was a masterclass in wielding power without flaunting it, like being the ventriloquist who convinces everyone the dummy is the one making all the decisions. The Hojo regents, particularly figures like Hojo Yasutoki, were surprisingly effective administrators. Yasutoki, for instance, promulgated the Goseibai Shikimoku in 1232, a legal code for the warrior class. This wasn't some abstract philosophical treatise. It was a practical set of laws dealing with land rights, inheritance dispute resolution, and the duties of vassals. It was written in clear, straightforward language that the often illiterate Bushi could understand, a far cry from the complex, illusion-filled pronouncements of the Kyoto court. It was all about clarity and order, bringing a new level of legal predictability to the samurai world. You could almost imagine them distributing pamphlets, disemboweling your neighbor over a misplaced rice seedling, see Article 12, subsection B. Life for a samurai during the Kamakura period was a mix of martial training and administrative duties, depending on their rank and location. The ideals of Kuba no Michi, the way of the horse and bow, were still paramount. Archery, swordsmanship, and horsemanship were constantly practiced. But for many, especially those serving as jito on distant estates, daily life involved managing peasants, collecting taxes, and settling local disputes. It could be quite mundane. You might spend more time arguing over irrigation rights than engaging in epic duels. Here's a quirky little detail from this era. Zen Buddhism began to gain significant traction among the samurai class during the Kamakura period. Its emphasis on discipline, self-reliance, meditation, and the acceptance of impermanence resonated with the warrior mindset. It offered a spiritual path that was direct and uncluttered, unlike some of the more elaborate rituals of older Buddhist sects. Plus, the idea of achieving enlightenment through sudden insight probably appealed to men who lived by quick decisions on the battlefield. It's certainly a more calming philosophy than, say, constantly worrying if your Taira ancestors are haunting your rice paddies. Historians still debate whether the Hojo regency was a usurpation of the Minamoto's rightful authority or a necessary stabilization that prevented the fledgling shogunate from collapsing into factional infighting after Yoritomo's death. Were they power-hungry manipulators or pragmatic guardians of a new order? The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the messy middle. They certainly weren't shy about dealing ruthlessly with anyone who challenged their authority, including members of the imperial family who occasionally got ambitious ideas about restoring direct imperial rule, like in the Jokyu War of 1221, which the Hojo decisively won, further cementing their control. So you can picture the scene in Kamakura, a bustling practical town filled with warriors turned bureaucrats. There's the clatter of accounting beads from a Jito's office, the rhythmic thwack of arrows hitting targets in a training yard, the serious discussions in the Hojo family council chambers. It's less about the dramatic flair of the Genpei War and more about the steady, often tedious work of building and maintaining a new form of government. The glorious history of the samurai is taking on a new dimension here, not just battlefield prowess, but the ability to govern, to create laws, and to manage a society. It's a bit like the difference between being a rock star and being the band's long-suffering tour manager who has to make sure all the hotel rooms are booked and no one trashes the bus. Both are important, but one involves a lot more paperwork. The rules were changing and the Hojo were holding the pen. The relative stability established by the Hojo regents with their sensible legal codes and their firm grip on the reins of the Kamakura shogunate is about to face an unprecedented challenge. You feel a chill wind blowing not from the internal squabbles of Japanese clans but from across the sea from the vast Mongol Empire. You're drifting into the latter half of the 13th century, specifically the years 1274 and 1281, when Japan faced the terrifying prospect of invasion by the forces of Kublai Khan. It was, to put it mildly, Kublai's very bad couple of days, or rather years. Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, had conquered China, establishing the Yuan dynasty. He was a man of immense ambition and power, ruling over an empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Korean peninsula. And Japan, a small island nation that had dared to ignore his demands for tribute and submission, was next on his to-do list. Imagine getting a letter from the most powerful ruler in the world essentially saying, "Bow down or else," and your government replies with a polite but firm, "Thanks but no thanks." The Hojo regents, particularly Hojo Tokimune, were not about to kowtow. It was a high-stakes gamble. The first invasion fleet arrived in 1274. A massive armada carrying Mongol, Chinese and Korean troops descended upon Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu. The samurai, who had spent generations fighting each other in a relatively ritualized form of warfare, think dramatic pre-battle pronouncements and one-on-one duels, were in for a rude awakening. The Mongols fought differently. They advanced in tight formations using coordinated infantry and cavalry with terrifying new weapons like gunpowder bombs, which were probably more loud bang and lots of smoke than truly devastating, but certainly unsettling and poisoned arrows. It was a clash of military doctrines, a medieval Japanese martial arts movie suddenly interrupted by a historical epic with a much bigger pyrotechnics budget. The Japanese warriors fought fiercely, defending their homeland with a desperate courage. You can picture them, their colorful oyuroi, a stark contrast to the more utilitarian armor of the invaders charging into the fray. But the sheer numbers and unfamiliar tactics of the Mongols were overwhelming. The defenders were pushed back and Hakata was in danger of falling. Then something unexpected happened. After a day of brutal fighting, the Mongol fleet, for reasons still debated by historians, perhaps due to casualties, supply issues, or the threat of a storm, withdrew to their ships. And that night, a massive typhoon swept through the bay, scattering and sinking a significant portion of the invasion force. The Japanese called it a kamikaze, a divine wind sent by the gods to protect their sacred land. It was certainly a convenient bit of weather. Undeterred, or perhaps just very stubborn, Kublai Khan decided to try again. He spent years preparing a much larger second invasion force. The Japanese, for their part, weren't idle. Under the direction of the Hojo, they built extensive stone walls along Hakata Bay, a defensive fortification designed to prevent the Mongols from landing easily. They also mobilized samurai from across the country, a massive defensive effort. You can imagine the tension, the entire nation holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable return. In 1281, the second armada arrived. It was even larger than the first, truly a colossal fleet. For weeks the fighting raged, the Japanese defenders, now better prepared, and with the advantage of their coastal walls, managed to hold the invaders at bay, preventing a major landing. Samurai in small boats swarmed the Mongol ships, engaging in fierce, hand-to-hand combat. It was a bloody, grueling stalemate. And then once again, nature intervened. A canonical historical fact, another massive typhoon, even more powerful than the first, struck the Mongol fleet while it was concentrated in Hakata Bay. The devastation was almost total, and ships were smashed against each other, driven ashore, or simply swallowed by the raging sea. Tens of thousands of invading soldiers perished. For the second time, a divine wind had seemingly saved Japan. Kublai Khan, facing enormous losses and troubles elsewhere in his vast empire, finally gave up on his Japanese ambitions. He probably crossed invade Japan off his to-do list with a very frustrated sigh. The psychological impact of these events on Japan was immense. The belief that Japan was a divinely protected land, Shinkoku, was powerfully reinforced. The samurai who fought in these campaigns became heroes, their bravery celebrated. However, the victories came at a huge cost. The shogunate had spent vast sums on defense, and rewarding the thousands of samurai who had fought was a massive financial and political problem. Many warriors felt they weren't adequately compensated for their sacrifices, leading to simmering resentment. The Hojo had successfully defended Japan, but the effort had severely strained their resources and authority. It's like throwing a massive, very expensive party to save your house from a termite infestation. You succeed, but you're broke, and everyone's complaining about the catering. Here's a quirky off-topic fact related to the Mongols. The Mongol Empire facilitated a period of unprecedented connectivity across Eurasia, known as the Pax Mongolica. This Mongol peace allowed for the safe passage of merchants, missionaries, and travelers, leading to a significant exchange of goods, ideas, and unfortunately, diseases like the Black Death between East and West. So while they were trying to invade Japan, their empire was also ironically a conduit for global interconnectedness. Talk about having a complicated legacy. Historians still debate the exact reasons for the Mongol withdrawals and the extent to which the typhoons were solely responsible for the Japanese victories. Some argue that logistical problems, disease among the Mongol troops, and the determined Japanese resistance played equally, if not more significant roles than the storms. Were the kamikaze truly decisive, or were they the final blows to already struggling invasion attempts? It's a fascinating point of contention. You can almost feel the salty spray from those typhoons, hear the roar of the wind and the splintering of ships. The image of the Mongol armada, so formidable and threatening, reduced to wreckage by the fury of nature and the tenacity of the defenders, is a powerful one. The samurai had faced their greatest external threat, and against the odds had prevailed. But the victory was a turning point. The unity forged in the face of invasion began to fray as internal problems, particularly economic ones, mounted. The glorious defense had planted the seeds of future instability. The Hojo had their moment of triumph, but the winds of change, both literal and metaphorical, were blowing hard. The divine winds might have saved Japan, but they also subtly altered the course of its history, weakening the very government that had orchestrated the defense. The divine winds have long since dissipated, and the memory of the Mongol threat, while still potent, is fading into legend. The Hojo Regency, which had so capably guided Japan through that existential crisis, found its authority increasingly eroded by the very success of its defense. The financial strain of the Mongol wars, coupled with the inability to adequately reward the samurai who had fought, created widespread discontent. You're now drifting into a period of growing instability in the early 14th century, a time when the carefully constructed Kamakura system began to unravel, leading to an unexpected and ultimately brief return of imperial power. The emperors in Kyoto, though largely ceremonial figures for over a century, had never entirely relinquished their theoretical claim to supreme authority. They were still considered divine descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and for some, the shogunate was always a usurpation, a military junta ruling in the emperor's name, but not truly with his blessing. One such emperor was Go-Daigo. He wasn't content with just performing rituals and composing poetry. He harbored ambitions of restoring direct imperial rule, of turning back the clock to a time before shoguns and regents called the shots. He was, you might say, a man with a retro taste in governance, longing for the good old days of imperial glory, which, if he'd looked closely, weren't always that glorious either. Go-Daigo began to conspire, gathering support from disaffected samurai powerful Buddhist monasteries who often had their own warrior monks, the Sohei, and significant landholdings and court nobles who yearned for a return to their former prominence. The Hojo, already weakened by internal divisions and economic woes, struggled to contain the growing anti-shogunate sentiment. Think of it as a slow-motion train wreck. Everyone can see it coming, but the brakes on the shogunate express are failing. One of the key figures who initially supported Go-Daigo was Ashikaga Takauji, a prominent general from a branch of the Minamoto clan. The Hojo dispatched Takauji to Kyoto to crush Go-Daigo's rebellion. However, in a move that would dramatically alter the course of Japanese history, Takauji switched sides. Instead of attacking the imperial forces, he joined them, turned against the Hojo, and attacked their headquarters in Rokuhara, Kyoto. It was a stunning betrayal or a savvy political calculation, depending on your perspective. It's like being sent to put out a fire and deciding to throw gasoline on it instead, then blaming the fire chief. With Takauji's defection, the tide turned decisively against the Hojo. In 1333, another powerful warrior, Nitta Yoshisada, attacked Kamakura itself. After fierce fighting, the city fell, and the last Hojo regent, Hojo Takatoki, along with many of his followers, committed suicide, bringing the Kamakura shogunate to a fiery and tragic end after nearly 150 years of rule. The Hojo, who had once seemed so unshakable, were swept away, and so began the Kenmu Restoration, the 1333-1336. Emperor Go-Daigo was back in charge, or so it seemed. He envisioned a return to direct imperial rule with himself at the center of power, making all the decisions. He abolished the shogunate, rewarded his supporters with land and titles, and set about trying to govern Japan according to ancient imperial precedents. It was a bold, ambitious plan. It was also unfortunately rather out of touch with the realities of 14th century Japan. A canonical historical fact. The Kenmu Restoration, despite its lofty ideals, lasted only about 3 years. It ultimately failed due to a combination of factors including Go-Daigo's political ineptitude, his favoritism towards the court aristocracy over the samurai, and the inherent difficulty of dismantling a deeply entrenched feudal system. He tried to centralize power too quickly, alienating many of the very samurai who had helped him to power. It was like trying to herd cats if the cats were heavily armed, deeply suspicious, and used to being in charge of their own litter boxes. The samurai, who had grown accustomed to the practical governance and legal framework of the Kamakura shogunate, found Go-Daigo's attempts to revive archaic courtly practices and his often arbitrary decisions frustrating. They had fought to overthrow the Hojo, not to trade one master for another who didn't understand their needs or respect their power. Ashikaga Takauji in particular felt sidelined and unappreciated by Go-Daigo. The emperor seemed more interested in rewarding his noble cronies than the warriors who had actually won him the throne. This was a classic case of be careful what you wish for and who you wish it with. Here's a quirky off-topic piece of information. During this tumultuous period, and indeed throughout much of Japanese history, divination and prophecy played a significant role. People looked for omens in natural events, consulted fortune-tellers, and interpreted dreams to try and understand the chaotic world around them and predict future events. Given the amount of backstabbing and shifting allegiances, you can hardly blame them for wanting a celestial heads-up. Is my top general going to betray me next Tuesday? The oracle says. Maybe. Historians still debate whether Emperor Go-Daigo's vision for a restored imperial government was a noble, albeit doomed, attempt to create a more centralized and just state, or if it was simply an anachronistic fantasy that ignored the profound societal changes that had occurred over the preceding centuries. Was he a visionary ahead of his time, or a man stubbornly trying to fit a square peg into a round hole while the peg was complaining about land distribution? The dissatisfaction among the samurai quickly boiled over. Ashikaga Takauji, feeling that Go-Daigo was leading Japan into chaos and probably also seeing an opportunity for himself, rose in rebellion against the emperor he had so recently helped restore. In 1336, Takauji defeated the imperial forces, drove Go-Daigo from Kyoto, and installed a rival claimant to the imperial throne. Go-Daigo fled south to Yoshino, where he established a rival southern court, while Takauji set up his own northern court in Kyoto. This marked the end of the brief Kenmu restoration and the beginning of an even more confusing period known as the Nanboku-cho, or the Age of the Northern and Southern Courts, which would last for nearly 60 years. Japan now had 2 emperors, 2 imperial courts, and a whole lot of samurai trying to figure out which side offered the better deal. The emperor's brief return to power had been a fleeting dream quickly shattered by the hard realities of warrior politics. The pendulum of power, which had swung briefly towards Kyoto, was now swinging decisively back towards the military class, and specifically towards the ambitious Ashikaga Takauji, who was about to usher in a new shogunate. The attempt to put the samurai genie back in the imperial bottle had failed spectacularly. The dust from Ashikaga Takauji's rebellion against Emperor Go-Daigo is still settling. But one thing is clear: the emperor's dream of a restored imperial government is over. Japan is now fractured with 2 rival imperial courts: Go-Daigo's southern court in the mountains of Yoshino and Takauji's puppet northern court in Kyoto. You're now drifting into the Muromachi period, named after the district in Kyoto, where the Ashikaga shoguns established their headquarters. This era, roughly spanning from 1336 to 1573, was a long, often turbulent, and incredibly complex chapter in Japanese history, a time of profound cultural blossoming set against a backdrop of almost continuous political decay and warfare. Ashikaga Takauji, having driven Go-Daigo out and installed his own emperor, had himself appointed shogun in 1338, officially founding the Ashikaga shogunate. However, unlike the Kamakura shogunate, which had maintained a strong centralized control, at least initially under Yoritomo, and then the Hojo, the Ashikaga shogunate was from its very inception a much weaker and more decentralized affair. Takauji had risen to power with the help of powerful regional warrior chieftain Shugo, and these figures weren't about to meekly surrender their newfound autonomy. They were more like powerful feudal lords in their own right, often ruling their provinces with little interference from the central government in Kyoto. The Ashikaga shoguns were often more like first among equals, constantly needing to negotiate, cajole, and occasionally fight to maintain their authority. It was like trying to run a company where all your department heads think they're the CEO. The first few decades of the Muromachi period were dominated by the ongoing conflict between the northern and southern courts, the Nanboku-cho Wars. This wasn't a constant raging inferno of battle, but rather a simmering, drawn-out struggle with shifting allegiances and periodic flare-ups. Samurai families often found themselves divided with different branches, supporting different courts, leading to bitter internal feuds. It was a confusing time to be a warrior. Your cousin might be your ally one week and your enemy the next, all depending on which emperor was offering the better land grants. Despite the political instability, or perhaps in some ways because of it, the Muromachi period witnessed a remarkable flourishing of Japanese culture. This is one of its great paradoxes. The Ashikaga shoguns, particularly figures like the third shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who famously built the Golden Pavilion Kinkakuji in Kyoto, and the eighth shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, who built the Silver Pavilion Ginkakuji, were lavish patrons of the arts. Their courts became centers of cultural innovation. A canonical historical fact is the significant development and popularization of Zen Buddhist-influenced arts during the Muromachi period. This includes the tea ceremony Chanoyu, which evolved from a simple monastic ritual into a highly refined aesthetic pursuit, emphasizing harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility, were Keisei Jaku. Ink wash painting, sumi-e, with its evocative landscapes and subtle gradations of black ink, reached new heights of artistic expression. No drama, a stylized and symbolic form of musical theater, was refined and patronized by the shogunal court, and landscape gardening, creating miniature idealized worlds in sandstone and moss, became a sophisticated art form often found in Zen temples. These cultural achievements, often characterized by a sense of refined simplicity or wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection and transience, stand in stark contrast to the often brutal and chaotic political reality of the time. It's as if, with the world outside their gilded pavilions frequently descending into turmoil, the Ashikaga shoguns and the cultural elites around them retreated into a world of aesthetic perfection. While provincial lords were bashing each other over the head for control of rice paddies, the shogun might be contemplating the subtle beauty of a single flower arrangement or the philosophical implications of a perfectly whisked bowl of matcha. It's a bit like fiddling while Rome burns, but the fiddling was producing some truly exquisite music. Here's a quirky fact. During the Muromachi period, there was a significant increase in trade and contact with Ming Dynasty China. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, in a move that was controversial among some Japanese who saw it as subservient, accepted the title King of Japan from the Chinese emperor in order to facilitate official trade. This trade brought not only wealth but also new cultural influences to Japan. One of the popular imports from China was high-quality ceramics, which spurred the development of Japan's own renowned pottery traditions. So while they were having their internal squabbles, they were also very keen on getting their hands on the latest Ming vases. Historians still debate the true extent of the Ashikaga shogun's actual power. Were they astute political operators who managed to maintain a semblance of control through a delicate balance of alliances and patronage, or were they largely figureheads presiding over a period of gradual decentralization where real power lay with the increasingly independent provincial shugo? The shogunate certainly lacked the robust administrative machinery of the Kamakura system, and its reliance on the goodwill of powerful regional lords made it inherently unstable. As the Nanbokucho Wars eventually sputtered to a close in 1392 with the southern court tricked or persuaded, depending on who you ask, into relinquishing its claim, a semblance of unity returned. However, the underlying weakness of the Ashikaga shogunate persisted. The Shugo, who had grown even more powerful during the long period of conflict, began to act like independent rulers in their own domains. They raised their own armies, collected their own taxes, and often ignored edicts from Kyoto. Some Shugo became so powerful that they were known as Shugo daimyo, a precursor to the great feudal lords of the later Warring States period. You can imagine the Ashikaga shogun sitting in his beautiful Kyoto palace surrounded by exquisite art and serene gardens, perhaps listening to a No performance, while reports trickle in of yet another provincial lord causing trouble or refusing to pay his dues. It's a picture of refined elegance teetering on the edge of anarchy. The cultural achievements of the Muromachi period are undeniable and have left a lasting legacy on Japanese aesthetics. But the political foundations of the Ashikaga shogunate were built on much shakier ground than those of its Kamakura predecessor. The arts were blooming, but the seeds of even greater conflict were being sown in the fertile soil of decentralized power and unchecked ambition. The stage was slowly being set for a complete breakdown of shogunal authority, leading to an era of even more intense and widespread warfare. The refined cultural pursuits of the Ashikaga shogunate, that delicate dance of tea ceremonies and No performances, couldn't indefinitely mask the crumbling political foundations beneath. The shoguns might have been connoisseurs of art, but their grip on the increasingly powerful regional lords, the Shugo daimyo, was becoming progressively weaker, like trying to hold on to a handful of wet noodles. You're now drifting into the mid-15th century, a period where the simmering tensions and rivalries finally boiled over into a devastating conflict that would shatter the remaining authority of the Ashikaga shogunate and plunge Japan into a century of chaos, the Onin War. The Onin War, which officially lasted from 1467 to 1477, wasn't a simple, clear-cut conflict with two easily identifiable sides. It was a messy, complex, and utterly bewildering affair, initially sparked by a succession dispute within the Ashikaga shogunate itself. The then shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, the same one who built the elegant silver pavilion, was an indecisive and ineffective leader, far more interested in his artistic pursuits than in the tedious business of governing. He initially named his younger brother as his heir, but then his wife gave birth to a son, and suddenly there were two potential claimants to the shogunal title. Cue the dramatic music and the sharpening of swords. This internal shogunal squabble became the spark that ignited a much larger powder keg. Two of the most powerful Shugo daimyo families, the Yamana and the Hosokawa, each with their own networks of allies and vassals, decided to back different claimants. Yamana Sozen, a grizzled veteran known as the Red Monk, supported the shogun's infant son. Hosokawa Katsumoto, a cultured and influential figure, supported the shogun's brother. It was less about loyalty to a particular claimant and more about an opportunity for these powerful clans to assert their dominance and settle old scores. It's like two rival schoolyard bullies picking teams for a fight, only the schoolyard is the entire capital city, and the teams are massive samurai armies. A canonical historical fact. The Onin War was fought primarily within the city of Kyoto itself. What was once the elegant capital, a center of culture and refinement, became a brutal battlefield. Vast sections of the city were burned to the ground, including magnificent temples, aristocratic mansions, and even parts of the imperial palace. The fighting was often street by street, house by house, a grinding urban warfare that dragged on for a decade. Imagine your beautiful historic neighborhood suddenly becoming a war zone with armies camping in your zen garden and launching attacks from your tea house. The war quickly escalated beyond the initial succession dispute, drawing in other powerful clans from across Japan, each with their own agendas and ambitions. Alliances shifted constantly. It became a free-for-all, a chaotic struggle for power and land. The Ashikaga shogun Yoshimasa was utterly powerless to stop the fighting. He reportedly continued his aesthetic pursuits, flower-arranging tea ceremonies, planning his silver pavilion, while his capital city burned around him. Perhaps it was his way of coping, a sort of keep calm and arrange chrysanthemums approach to civic disaster. The armies involved were huge tens of thousands of samurai and ashigaru foot soldiers, whose importance was growing in this period, converging on Kyoto. The nature of warfare was also changing. While individual samurai duels still occurred, the Onin War saw more organized formations and siege tactics. The ashigaru, often peasants armed with spears or bows, played an increasingly vital role, not as heroic individual warriors, but as a disciplined infantry force. They were the cannon fodder, but also the backbone of the warring armies. Here's a quirky detail about the Onin War that highlights its sheer absurdity. At one point, both the Yamana and Hosokawa armies were encamped in different parts of Kyoto, sometimes for months on end, with occasional truces or lulls in the fighting. During these lulls, it's said that samurai from opposing sides might even mingle trade goods or visit the same noodle stalls before returning to their camps to prepare for the next round of slaughter. It's a bizarre image of civility punctuated by extreme violence, like having a polite chat with someone just before you try to burn their house down. Historians still debate the precise long-term consequences of the Onin War. While it didn't immediately end the Ashikaga shogunate, it limped on in name for another century. It completely destroyed its authority and prestige. The shogun became little more than a puppet controlled by whichever powerful lord happened to have military dominance in Kyoto at the time. The war also accelerated the breakdown of the old Shuin estate system and the rise of the daimyo, powerful independent feudal lords who ruled their own territories with their own armies. The rules of the old order were shattered. After a decade of relentless fighting, Kyoto was a smoking ruin. The war ended not with a decisive victory for either side, but more out of sheer exhaustion and the realization that the conflict was destroying everyone involved. The Yamana and Hosokawa leaders had died, and their successors were weary of the endless bloodshed. But the damage was done. The central government was a hollow shell. The peace that followed was no peace at all, but rather the opening act for an even more violent and protracted period of conflict known as the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States. You can almost smell the ashes of Kyoto, feel the despair of its citizens who saw their world crumble. The Onin War was a watershed moment. It was the messy, brutal, and chaotic divorce of the regional powers from any semblance of central authority. The art and culture that had flourished under the earlier Ashikaga might have survived in pockets, but the dominant theme of the next century would be the clang of steel, the ambition of warlords, and the struggle for survival in a land where the only law was the law of the strongest. The glorious history of the samurai was about to enter its most savage and legendary phase. The polite veneer of shogunal rule had been stripped away, revealing the raw, competitive heart of feudal Japan. The smouldering ruins of Kyoto, ravaged by the Onin War, serve as a grim overture to the era you're now entering, the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. This period, stretching roughly from the end of the Onin War in 1477 to the late 16th century around 1573 or even later, depending on how you mark its end, was one of the most turbulent and violent in Japanese history. The Ashikaga shogunate still existed in name, a ghost haunting the charred remains of its former authority in Kyoto, but real power had fragmented completely. It was warlords everywhere, a nationwide no-holds-barred battle royale for control of Japan. Imagine Japan as a shattered mirror, each shard reflecting the ambitions of a local strongman, a daimyo. These weren't necessarily the old Shugo daimyo families who had risen under the Ashikaga. Many of those older established clans were overthrown or saw their power eroded from below. The Sengoku Jidai was characterized by Gekkokujo, a term meaning the low overthrowing the high. Vassals betrayed their lord's branch families, usurped main lineages, and men of humble origin could, through ruthlessness and military skill, rise to become powerful rulers. It was a chaotic Darwinian struggle where only the most cunning, adaptable, and utterly merciless survived and thrived. Your social standing mattered less than the sharpness of your sword and the loyalty, however temporary, of your retainers. It was like a corporate ladder where promotions were achieved via hostile takeover, often involving actual hostilities. The daimyo of the Sengoku period were a new breed of ruler. They carved out their own domains, built formidable castles, a far cry from the earlier simpler fortifications, raised private armies, and promulgated their own house laws, kaho. Their primary concerns were expanding their territory, defending it from avaricious neighbors, and ensuring the loyalty of their samurai retainers. Loyalty was a precious and often fickle commodity. A samurai might serve one lord today, and if offered a better deal, or if his current lord showed signs of weakness, switch allegiance tomorrow. It wasn't necessarily seen as treachery, but as pragmatic survival in a world where today's ally could be tomorrow's corpse. Warfare in the Sengoku Jidai became endemic, almost a constant state of being. It also evolved significantly. While the mounted samurai archer was still a potent force, massed infantry formations of ashigaru, armed with long spears, yari became increasingly important. Pike walls could effectively counter cavalry charges, and large numbers of relatively easily trained spearmen could overwhelm smaller groups of elite samurai. Strategy and tactics became more sophisticated, with an emphasis on siege warfare, as castles became more elaborate intelligence gathering and logistics. It wasn't just about heroic charges anymore, it was about outmaneuvering and outlasting your opponent. Sun Tzu's Art of War. An ancient Chinese military treatise became very popular reading among ambitious daimyo, probably more useful than the latest poetry anthology from Kyoto. A canonical historical fact for this era is the introduction of firearms to Japan by Portuguese traders in 1543. They landed on the island of Tanegashima, and the local Lord Tanegashima Tokitaka was quick to recognize the potential of these new fire sticks, matchlock arquebuses. The Japanese proved to be remarkably adept at replicating and improving upon this technology. Within a few decades, firearms were being mass-produced and were playing an increasingly significant role on the battlefield, further changing the nature of samurai warfare. Suddenly, a well-aimed shot from a relatively untrained ashigaru could bring down a heavily armored samurai who had spent years perfecting his swordsmanship. This was a real game-changer, and not everyone was thrilled about it. The castles of the Sengoku Jidai were impressive feats of engineering designed to withstand prolonged sieges. Think of Himeji Castle. Though much of its current form is slightly later, its foundations are from this era, or the many other mountain-top fortresses. They featured complex layouts, massive stone walls, and strategically placed towers for archers and later gunmen. Controlling a province often meant controlling its key castles. You could almost imagine a daimyo playing a real-life version of Risk with spies instead of dice rolls, determining the outcome of attacks on fortified positions. Here's a quirky fact about the Sengoku period. Despite the constant warfare, or perhaps because of the need for resources to fund it, domestic trade and commerce actually flourished in many areas. Castle towns Jokamachi grew up around the daimyo's headquarters, becoming centers of artisanal production and trade. New merchant classes emerged, and some port cities like Sakai near modern Osaka became wealthy, semi-autonomous entities, managing their own affairs and even hiring mercenary samurai for their defense. It's a bit like finding a bustling farmer's market in the middle of a war zone. Life and commerce find a way. Historians still debate the overall impact of the Sengoku Jidai on Japanese society. Was it simply a century of destructive chaos, or did the intense competition also foster innovation, social mobility, and the eventual emergence of a more unified and dynamic nation? The constant warfare certainly led to advancements in military technology and tactics, and the rise of the daimyo created new, more efficient forms of regional governance. But the cost in human suffering was immense. Peasants were frequently conscripted, their crops requisitioned or destroyed, and their lives disrupted by the endless campaigns of their warring masters. You can feel the tension in the air, the constant vigilance required to survive. A rustle in the trees might be an assassin, a friendly overture from a neighboring lord might be a trap. The samurai of this era were hardened, pragmatic, and often deeply cynical. The idealistic codes of honor of earlier times were still paid lip service, but survival and victory often trumped all other considerations. This was the crucible that forged some of Japan's most famous and formidable warriors and leaders. The glorious history of the ancient samurai was being written in blood across a landscape fractured by ambition and defined by the relentless struggle for power. The old Ashikaga order was dead, the new order was yet to be born, and its birth pangs were violent and prolonged. The chaotic free-for-all of the Sengoku Jidai, that seemingly endless scramble of warlords clawing for power, couldn't last forever. Eventually, out of the myriad ambitious daimyo, a few exceptionally capable and ruthless individuals would rise to prominence, individuals who possessed not just military prowess, but also the vision and organizational skill to begin the monumental task of reunifying Japan. You're now witnessing the emergence of one of the most pivotal and controversial figures in Japanese history, Oda Nobunaga. His ambition was legendary and his impact undeniable. Oda Nobunaga, 1534-1582, inherited control of Owari Province, a relatively small and unassuming domain in central Japan. He wasn't born into one of the most powerful established clans, but he possessed a brilliant, unconventional military mind, a willingness to embrace new technologies and tactics, and a reputation for utter ruthlessness towards his enemies. He was also known for his volatile temper and his disdain for tradition, which often shocked his more conservative contemporaries. Think of him as the disruptive tech-bro CEO of 16th century Japan, shaking up the old feudal system with radical new ideas and a move fast and break things, often break enemies attitude. Nobunaga's rise was marked by a series of audacious and brilliant military victories. One of his early signature triumphs was the Battle of Okehazama in 1560. Vastly outnumbered by the forces of Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful daimyo of the time, Nobunaga launched a surprise attack during a thunderstorm, catching the Imagawa army completely off guard. Yoshimoto was killed and his army disintegrated. This victory catapulted Nobunaga onto the national stage, announcing him as a major contender for power. It was the Sengoku equivalent of a startup company suddenly toppling an industry giant. He was a master strategist and an innovator. A canonical historical fact is Nobunaga's effective use of firearms. While other daimyo were also adopting matchlock arquebuses, Nobunaga was among the first to truly understand their potential and integrate them systematically into his armies. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, his forces, employing rotating volleys of gunfire from behind wooden palisades, decimated the famed cavalry charges of the Takeda clan. This battle is often cited as a turning point in Japanese military history, demonstrating the declining effectiveness of traditional samurai cavalry against disciplined gunpowder infantry. The era of the lone heroic samurai was giving way to the era of organized technologically equipped armies. Nobunaga wasn't just about winning battles, though. He also implemented radical economic and administrative reforms in the territories he conquered. He abolished toll barriers that hindered trade, conducted land surveys to rationalize taxation, and promoted commerce by creating free markets, rakuichi, rakuza. He understood that military strength needed to be supported by a strong economic base. He was also notoriously hostile towards the powerful, often militant Buddhist monasteries, which he saw as rivals to his authority and obstacles to unification. He didn't hesitate to destroy them, most famously burning the Enryaku-ji temple complex on Mount Hiei, a center of Tendai Buddhism, and slaughtering thousands of its inhabitants. This act cemented his reputation for brutality, but also eliminated a significant political and military threat. As his power grew, Nobunaga began to envision a unified Japan under his rule. He marched on Kyoto in 1568 ostensibly to install Ashikaga Yoshiaki as shogun, but in reality, Yoshiaki became his puppet. Nobunaga effectively controlled the central region of Japan, the agricultural and economic heartland. His ambition was seemingly boundless, his motto, Tenkafubu, often interpreted as rule the empire by military force, or bring the realm under one sword. He wasn't just collecting provinces, he was trying to build a new order. Here's a quirky or off-topic fact related to Nobunaga. He was known for his interest in Western culture and artifacts, a rarity among Japanese leaders of his time. He met with Jesuit missionaries, wore Western-style clothing on occasion, and collected European goods like wine glasses and maps. Some historians suggest this openness to foreign ideas contributed to his innovative thinking, while others see it as mere curiosity. Perhaps he just thought a Portuguese hat looked good with his armor. Historians still debate Nobunaga's ultimate goals and his true character. Was he a cruel tyrant, a demon king, as some of his enemies called him, driven solely by a lust for power, or was he a visionary, albeit a ruthless one, who laid the essential groundwork for Japan's reunification after a century of devastating civil war? He certainly wasn't a man who inspired lukewarm opinions. You either admired his decisiveness and vision, or you feared his wrath. His meteoric rise, however, came to an abrupt and dramatic end. In 1582, while staying at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, with only a small contingent of guards, Nobunaga was betrayed and attacked by one of his most trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. The reasons for Akechi's betrayal are still a subject of much speculation. Personal ambition, a long-held grudge, a response to Nobunaga's increasingly tyrannical behavior, or perhaps he was just tired of Nobunaga's terrible karaoke nights. Okay, maybe not that last one. Surrounded and overwhelmed Oda Nobunaga, the man who had come so close to conquering all of Japan, committed seppuku ritual suicide in the burning temple. The news of Nobunaga's death sent shockwaves across Japan. The Demon King was dead, and the future of the unification project he had so vigorously pursued was suddenly thrown into uncertainty. But Nobunaga's legacy was profound. He had shattered many of the old feudal structures, introduced new military and administrative methods, and most importantly, had shown that reunification was possible. The path was now clear, if perilous, for another to pick up his fallen banner and complete the task. The age of warring states was not yet over, but Oda Nobunaga had irrevocably changed its trajectory. His ambition, though cut short, had paved the way for the final act of Japan's long journey towards unity. The flames of Honnoji had barely died down, and with Oda Nobunaga's sudden violent demise, Japan was once again teetering on the brink of chaos. The carefully constructed, albeit brutally enforced order Nobunaga was building seemed ready to shatter. Several of Nobunaga's powerful generals were positioned to make a play for supremacy, to pick up the pieces of his shattered ambition. But one man, more than any other, possessed the cunning, the speed, and the sheer audacity to seize the moment. You're now witnessing the meteoric ascent of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a figure whose story is one of the most remarkable rags-to-riches tales in Japanese history. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, E.C., 1537–1598, unlike Nobunaga, who came from minor samurai stock, was born a peasant, the son of a foot soldier. He was said to be physically unprepossessing, short, thin, and with facial features that earned him the rather unflattering nickname Monkey from Nobunaga, though likely not to his face at least, not until Hideyoshi became incredibly powerful. What he lacked in noble lineage or imposing stature, however, he more than made up for with intelligence, resourcefulness, and an uncanny ability to understand and manipulate people. He started his career as a humble sandal-bearer for Oda Nobunaga, a position so lowly it's almost a punchline, but through sheer talent and loyalty, he rose through the ranks to become one of Nobunaga's most capable and trusted generals. When news of Nobunaga's assassination by Akechi Mitsuhide reached Hideyoshi, he was engaged in a siege far to the west. In a stunning display of strategic brilliance and rapid movement, Hideyoshi quickly made peace with his opponents, force-marched his army back towards Kyoto at incredible speed, a feat known as the Chugoku Return, and confronted Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki. Just 13 days after Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi decisively defeated Akechi, avenging his fallen lord and positioning himself as Nobunaga's natural successor. It was a masterstroke, a lightning campaign that left his rivals scrambling. It's like finding out your boss has been unexpectedly downsized and you immediately launch a flawless plan to take over the company before anyone else even updates their resume. With Akechi out of the way, Hideyoshi then had to deal with the other powerful Oda vassals who also had their eyes on the top spot, most notably Shibata Katsuie. After a period of political maneuvering and further military campaigns culminating in Hideyoshi's victory at the Battle of Shizugatake in 1583, his supremacy became undeniable. He didn't immediately take the title of shogun. His peasant birth made that problematic in the eyes of traditionalists. Instead, he cleverly maneuvered to be appointed Kampaku Imperial Regent, a high-ranking court position that effectively gave him legitimate authority to rule Japan. He later also received the surname Toyotomi Bountiful Minister from the emperor, further solidifying his prestige. A canonical historical fact is that Toyotomi Hideyoshi completed the unification of Japan that Oda Nobunaga had begun. Through a combination of military force diplomacy and strategic alliances, he brought the remaining independent daimyo under his control. The last major holdouts, the powerful Hojo clan in eastern Japan, a different Hojo clan from the Kamakura regents, were defeated at the siege of Odawara in 1590. With this victory, Hideyoshi had effectively united all of Japan under his rule, ending over a century of relentless civil war. It was an extraordinary achievement for a man who had started life with nothing. Once in power, Hideyoshi implemented a series of sweeping reforms designed to consolidate his rule and prevent a return to the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai. One of his most famous policies was the sword hunt, Katanagari of 1588, which ordered the disarmament of the peasantry. Only samurai were permitted to wear swords, thus solidifying the social hierarchy and reducing the likelihood of peasant uprisings. He also conducted extensive land surveys, Taiko Kenshi, which rationalized land ownership and taxation, providing a stable economic foundation for his government. These surveys also helped to firmly tie the samurai to the land and to their lords, further cementing the feudal structure. He was trying to ensure that no other ambitious sandal-bearers could follow his exact path to power. Here's a quirky fact about Hideyoshi. He was known for his love of grand, ostentatious displays of wealth and power. He built a magnificent castle in Osaka, famed for its opulence, and he was also famous for hosting an extravagant outdoor tea ceremony at Kitano Tenmangu Shrine in Kyoto in 1587, to which he invited people from all social classes. It was a massive public relations event showcasing his cultural patronage and his control over the nation. He even had a portable golden tea room constructed. It was all very subtle in a look how incredibly rich and powerful I am sort of way. Historians still debate the nature of Hideyoshi's rule. Was he a benevolent unifier who brought peace and stability to a war-torn land, or an ambitious autocrat whose later years were marred by megalomania and disastrous foreign adventures? After unifying Japan, Hideyoshi, perhaps driven by a desire for even greater glory or to provide an outlet for the vast numbers of now unemployed samurai, launched two massive and ultimately disastrous invasions of Korea in the 1590s with the ultimate goal of conquering Ming China. These campaigns drained Japan's resources and achieved little tarnishing his legacy. Despite these later missteps, Hideyoshi's achievement in unifying Japan was monumental. He had risen from the lowest rungs of society to become its supreme ruler, a testament to his extraordinary abilities. He laid much of the groundwork for the long period of peace that would follow. However, like Nobunaga, he failed to establish a stable succession. His only son, Hideyori, was just a child when Hideyoshi died in 1598. Hideyoshi appointed a council of 5 powerful regents Goteiro to rule until Hideyori came of age, hoping to ensure a smooth transition. But with Hideyoshi gone, the old rivalries and ambitions among the most powerful daimyo quickly resurfaced. The peace he had worked so hard to achieve was fragile, and the stage was set for one last great showdown to determine who would truly master the newly unified Japan. The passing of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598 left a gaping power vacuum at the heart of Japan. His son and heir, Toyotomi Hideyori, was a mere child, and the carefully constructed council of 5 powerful regents, the Goteiro, who were supposed to govern in his name and ensure a smooth succession, was a recipe for infighting. It was like leaving 5 hungry wolves to guard a single steak, with the understanding they'd all share nicely. You are now drifting towards the inevitable collision of these titanic ambitions, a showdown that would decide the ultimate fate of the unified Japan Hideyoshi had forged, the Battle of Sekigahara. Among the 5 regents, one figure quickly emerged as the most powerful, ambitious, and strategically astute Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu was a veteran daimyo from a long-lineage lord of the vast and wealthy Kanto region in eastern Japan. He had been an ally of Oda Nobunaga and later a reluctant but powerful vassal of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He was known for his patience, his cunning, and his long-term strategic thinking. While other daimyo might rush into glorious but risky battles, Ieyasu was a master of waiting for the opportune moment of playing the long game. He was the tortoise to many a hasty hare in the Sengoku Jidai, and he usually ended up winning the race. The other regents, particularly Ishida Mitsunari, a loyal retainer of Hideyoshi and a skilled administrator, but perhaps less adept at military command and personal diplomacy, grew increasingly suspicious of Ieyasu's growing influence and his blatant moves to consolidate his own power. Mitsunari began to rally those daimyo who remained loyal to the Toyotomi cause, or who simply feared and resented Tokugawa's dominance. Japan quickly polarized into 2 massive armed camps, the Western Army loyal to the Toyotomi heir and largely orchestrated by Ishida Mitsunari, and the Eastern Army under the command of Tokugawa Ieyasu. The tension mounted throughout 1600. Both sides maneuvered their forces, engaging in preliminary skirmishes and sieges, trying to secure strategic castles and gain the allegiance of uncommitted daimyo. It was a massive game of military chess played across the map of central Japan, with the fate of the nation hanging in the balance. The air itself must have felt thick with anticipation and the scent of impending conflict. A canonical historical fact. The Battle of Sekigahara, fought on October 20, 1600, by the Western calendar, was one of the largest and most decisive battles in Japanese feudal history. It took place in a narrow valley in Mino Province, modern-day Gifu Prefecture, a strategically important crossroads. Vast armies numbering well over 150,000 men in total converged for this single, cataclysmic engagement. The sheer scale of it is difficult to comprehend, a sea of banners, armor spears, and matchlocks ready to decide Japan's future in a few brutal hours. The battle itself was a confused and desperate affair. The Western Army under Mitsunari initially held a numerically superior and advantageous geographical position. However, Ieyasu's forces were generally more experienced and better led at the command level. The fighting was fierce, with heavy casualties on both sides, The outcome hung in the balance for several hours. You can imagine the din, the roar of cannon, still relatively new, but present the crackle of thousands of matchlocks, the shouts of commanders, the clash of steel, and the cries of the wounded. It would have been a terrifying, disorienting maelstrom of violence. The turning point of the battle came not necessarily through sheer tactical brilliance on Ieyasu's part during the fighting itself, but through pre-battle diplomacy and, crucially, betrayal. Several key daimyo, who were nominally allied with the Western army, had secretly pledged their allegiance to Ieyasu or were waiting to see which way the wind blew. As the battle raged, Kobayakawa Hideaki, a powerful daimyo commanding a large contingent on the flank of the Western army, hesitated for hours. Finally, reportedly prodded by a volley of warning shots fired into his ranks by Ieyasu's impatient troops, Kobayakawa switched sides and attacked the Western army's flank. This betrayal triggered a chain reaction with other wavering lords joining the Eastern army or simply withdrawing from the fight. The Western army collapsed and Ishida Mitsunari's forces were routed. It was like watching a crucial player in a championship game suddenly switch jerseys and score for the opposing team. The aftermath of Sekigahara was decisive. Ishida Mitsunari was captured and executed along with other key leaders of the Western army. Tokugawa Ieyasu was now the undisputed master of Japan. He moved swiftly to consolidate his victory, redistributing land and titles, rewarding his loyal vassals, and punishing those who had opposed him. The vast territories of the defeated daimyo were confiscated and either added to Tokugawa domains or given to his allies. The Toyotomi clan, though not immediately destroyed, was severely weakened, confined to Osaka Castle with greatly reduced lands and influence. Here's a quirky detail about the battle. Legend has it that Miyamoto Musashi, the famous swordsman and author of The Book of Five Rings, fought at Sekigahara on the losing side, the Western army, as a young man. He supposedly survived the slaughter and escaped, which, if true, adds another layer to his already legendary life. Imagine trying to make your way through that chaos as a teenager with nothing but your swords and your wits. Historians still debate the exact motivations of some of the key players at Sekigahara, particularly those who betrayed the Western army. Were they driven by long-standing grudges against Ishida Mitsunari, promises of reward from Ieyasu, or simply a pragmatic assessment of who was most likely to win the complex web of personal relationships, feudal loyalties, and raw ambition that characterized the Sengoku Jidai played out in dramatic fashion on that battlefield? The Battle of Sekigahara effectively ended the Sengoku Jidai. The century and a half of near-constant civil war was over. While it would take a few more years for Ieyasu to completely eliminate the Toyotomi threat, which he did with the sieges of Osaka Castle in 1614-1615, finally destroying the Toyotomi clan, Sekigahara was the moment the die was cast. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient strategist, had outmaneuvered and outfought all his rivals. He now had the power to impose a lasting peace on Japan and to establish a new shogunate that would endure for over 250 years. The ground at Sekigahara, soaked with the blood of tens of thousands, became the foundation stone of the Tokugawa peace. The glorious and often brutal history of the ancient samurai was entering its final long phase of transformation. The dust and smoke from Sekigahara have cleared, revealing a Japan dramatically reshaped by Tokugawa Ieyasu's decisive victory. The long, bloody chapter of the Sengoku Jidai is finally closed, and a new era is dawning, an era that will be characterized not by constant warfare but by an enforced, meticulously managed peace. You are now entering the Edo period, named after the city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, which Ieyasu made his new capital, the seat of the Tokugawa shogunate. This period, lasting from 1603 to 1868, would see the samurai class undergo a profound transformation, moving from warriors to bureaucrats. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu, having consolidated his power, received the title of shogun from the emperor, officially establishing the Tokugawa shogunate. Unlike the often weak Ashikaga shogunate, the Tokugawa regime was designed from the ground up to ensure stability and prevent any resurgence of the kind of regional autonomy that had led to the Warring States period. Ieyasu and his successors were master social engineers, creating a rigid hierarchical society with the shogun at the apex, followed by the daimyo, then the samurai, and then in descending order, farmers, artisans, and merchants, though in reality, wealthy merchants often wielded considerable influence. It was a system designed to keep everyone in their place, literally and figuratively. If the Sengoku Jidai was a chaotic mosh pit, the Edo period was a strictly choreographed ballet with Ieyasu as the demanding choreographer. A cornerstone of Tokugawa control was the Bakuhan system, a clever balance between the central authority of the Bakufu shogunate in Edo and the semi-autonomous domains ruled by the approximately 250-300 daimyo. The daimyo were categorized based on their relationship to the Tokugawa clan, Shinpan relatives, of the Tokugawa Fudai hereditary vassals who had supported Ieyasu before Sekigahara, and Tozama outside lords who had only submitted after Sekigahara or had even fought against him. The Tozama daimyo were generally given lands further from Edo and were watched with particular suspicion. It was a system of checks and balances designed to prevent any single daimyo or coalition from becoming powerful enough to challenge the shogun. A canonical historical fact is the implementation of the Sankin Kotai system, or alternate attendance. This ingenious policy required daimyo to spend alternate years or other set periods in attendance at the shogun's court in Edo, and when they returned to their domains, they had to leave their wives and heirs in Edo as effective hostages. This had several effects. It was a huge financial drain on the daimyo, reducing their ability to fund rebellions. It ensured their loyalty as their families were under the shogun's watch, and it stimulated the economy along the routes to and from Edo as vast entourages traveled back and forth. Imagine having to commute hundreds of miles every other year with a massive entourage and leave your family behind, all to show your boss you weren't planning a coup. For the samurai class, the long Tokugawa peace, often called the Pax Tokugawa, brought about a fundamental change in their role. With no major wars to fight, their martial skills, while still prized in theory, became less practically relevant. Many samurai transitioned into administrative roles, serving as bureaucrats, officials, and clerks in the service of the shogun or their local daimyo. They were still the ruling class, entitled to wear two swords as a mark of their status, but their daily lives often revolved around paperwork, rice stipends, and adherence to a strict code of conduct rather than battlefield glory. The pen, or at least the accounting brush, became mightier than the sword for many. It's a bit like an elite special forces unit being reassigned to manage the company's HR department. The early Edo period was a time of significant economic growth and urbanization. Edo itself grew from a small castle town into one of the largest cities in the world. Osaka became a major commercial hub, known as Japan's kitchen for its role in the rice trade. A vibrant popular culture flourished, particularly in the cities catering to the tastes of the rising merchant class and even some samurai. This included kabuki theater with its dramatic stories and elaborate costumes, ukiyo-e woodblock prints depicting scenes from everyday life, beautiful courtesans and famous actors, think Hokusai's Great Wave, and popular literature. Here's a quirky fact about this period. The Tokugawa shogunate implemented a strict policy of national seclusion known as sakoku, starting in the 1630s. For over 2 centuries, Japan was largely cut off from the outside world. Foreigners were expelled with the exception of limited trade with the Dutch and Chinese. At the port of Nagasaki, Japanese were forbidden to leave the country, and Christianity, which had gained some converts, was brutally suppressed. This policy was designed to prevent foreign interference and maintain social stability. It also meant that Japan developed in a unique, somewhat insular way during this long period. It was like the entire country put up a do not disturb sign for 200 years. Historians still debate the long-term effects of the sakoku policy. Did it allow Japan to develop its unique culture and institutions without disruptive foreign influences, leading to a period of remarkable internal peace and stability? Or did it cause Japan to fall behind technologically and economically compared to the rapidly industrializing West, ultimately making it vulnerable when foreign powers returned in the 19th century. The Tokugawa shogunate, built on the foundations laid by Ieyasu, proved to be remarkably durable. For over 2.5 centuries it maintained peace and order, a stark contrast to the preceding centuries of turmoil. The samurai, once fierce warriors carving out domains with their swords, were now largely salaried officials, their lives governed by rank etiquette and the dictates of their lords. Their glorious history was taking a turn towards the mundane, but it was a peaceful mundane, at least for a while. The long peace was a monumental achievement, but it would also sow the seeds of new challenges and transformations for the samurai class, as their traditional role became increasingly anachronistic in a world without war. The meticulously ordered world of the Tokugawa shogunate, with its rigid social hierarchy and its enforced peace, continued for century after century. The samurai, once the undisputed masters of the battlefield, now found themselves in an increasingly paradoxical position. The long peace, the very success of the Tokugawa system, was in a way becoming boring for a class whose identity was so deeply rooted in martial prowess. You're now drifting through the later Edo period, a time when the samurai's swords gathered more dust than blood, and their traditional skills faced the slow erosion of disuse and societal change. Generations of samurai were born and died without ever experiencing actual combat. Their training in swordsmanship, archery, and other martial arts, bujutsu, continued often with a great deal of emphasis on form and tradition, but it lacked the grim urgency of a life-or-death struggle. It became for many more of a ritualized practice, a way of maintaining status and identity, rather than a preparation for imminent battle. Think of it like a firefighter in a town where fires have been outlawed for 200 years. They still drill, they still maintain their equipment, but the immediate practical application is missing. The economic situation for many samurai also became increasingly precarious. Their stipends, paid in rice by their daimyo or the shogunate, were often fixed, while the cost of living, especially in the growing cities, tended to rise. Many lower-ranking samurai faced genuine poverty, forced to take on side jobs, sometimes in secret, as manual labor was considered beneath their status, or to marry into merchant families for financial support, a practice officially frowned upon but often a practical necessity. The once proud warrior might find himself struggling to make ends meet, his 2 swords a symbol of a status that didn't always translate into a full rice bowl. It's hard to maintain a fearsome warrior mystique when you're secretly weaving sandals at night to pay the bills. Despite this, the samurai was still the ruling elite, and the ideals of Bushido, the way of the warrior, continued to be articulated and refined, perhaps even more so as its practical application waned. Philosophers and scholars of the Edo period wrote extensively about loyalty, honor, self-discipline, and indifference to pain and death. These texts, like Yamamoto Tsunetomo's Hagakure, written in the early 18th century, long after the wars had ended, emphasized an almost fanatical devotion to one's lord and a readiness to die at a moment's notice. It's an interesting phenomenon. The more theoretical warfare became, the more idealized and extreme the warrior code sometimes appeared in writing. It's like writing incredibly detailed manuals on how to fight dragons centuries after the last dragon was sighted. A canonical historical fact of the later Edo period is the rise of various schools of learning and intellectual currents. While sakoku, limited foreign contact domestic scholarship, flourished, Kokugaku, national learning scholars, sought to uncover and celebrate Japan's unique indigenous traditions, often reacting against the dominance of Chinese Neo-Confucian thought, which formed the official ideology of the shogunate. Simultaneously, Rangaku Dutch learning allowed a trickle of Western scientific and medical knowledge to enter Japan through the Dutch trading post at Dejima in Nagasaki. This created a small but influential group of scholars who were aware of developments in the outside world, sowing seeds of curiosity and eventually concern about Japan's isolation. The long peace also led to a certain ossification of the social structure. While the Tokugawa system was designed for stability, it also made social mobility extremely difficult. A samurai was born a samurai, A peasant was born a peasant. This rigidity, coupled with economic pressures and the intellectual ferment of new ideas, began to create underlying tensions within Japanese society. Some samurai, particularly those from poorer domains or those influenced by kokugaku or rangaku, began to question the legitimacy and effectiveness of the shogunate. Here's a quirky fact about this period of samurai peace. With fewer opportunities for martial glory, some samurai channeled their energies into other pursuits, including scholarship, poetry, and even a refined appreciation for things like bonsai or the raising of specific breeds of crickets for their song. The warrior spirit, finding no outlet in battle, sometimes manifested in an intense dedication to seemingly peaceful, if rather niche, hobbies. You can imagine a fearsome-looking samurai meticulously trimming a tiny tree or intently listening to a cricket cage with the same focus he might once have applied to a sword kata. Historians still debate the extent to which the samurai class as a whole experienced a decline during the later Edo period. While their martial function was certainly diminished, and many faced economic hardship, they still constituted the political and administrative backbone of the country. They were the educated elite, and their ethical code, however, idealized, continued to shape societal values. Was it a period of decay or one of complex adaptation and internal development under the constraints of a prolonged peace? The world outside Japan, however, was not standing still. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Europe and America. Western powers, with their advanced military technology and their growing appetite for global trade and influence, were beginning to cast their eyes towards Asia. The black ships of Western navies were appearing with increasing frequency off Japan's coasts, a stark reminder that the country's self-imposed isolation could not last forever. The long, quiet afternoon of the Tokugawa peace was drawing to a close, and the samurai, whose swords had rested in their scabbards for so long, would soon face a challenge unlike any they had encountered before. Not from a rival daimyo, but from a world that had changed dramatically while Japan slumbered. The boring peace was about to get very interesting, and not in a good way for the old order. The long, sleepy afternoon of the Tokugawa shogunate, with its carefully ordered society and its samurai administrators, is about to be rudely awakened. The black ships of the Western powers, those smoke-belching harbingers of change, are no longer just distant rumors but a very present and insistent reality. You're now drifting into the mid-19th century, a period of immense upheaval and transformation that will see the centuries-old samurai class face its ultimate crisis and the formal end of its privileged existence, the Meiji Restoration. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy in Edo Bay in 1853 with his heavily armed steam frigates was the catalyst. Perry came with a demand from the U.S. President: Japan must open its ports to American trade and diplomatic relations. His ships, technologically far superior to anything Japan possessed, were a stark demonstration of Western military might. The shogunate, which had maintained its Sakoku national seclusion policy for over 2 centuries, was faced with an impossible choice: resist and face probable defeat and colonization, or capitulate and face a massive loss of prestige and potential internal chaos. It was like being challenged to a duel when your opponent has a cannon and you have a very nicely polished but ultimately outmatched sword. After much internal debate and consternation, the shogunate, under duress, signed treaties with the United States and other Western powers, opening several ports and granting them extraterritorial rights, meaning foreigners in Japan were subject to their own laws, not Japanese laws. These unequal treaties were deeply humiliating for many Japanese, particularly within the samurai class, and fueled a growing anti-foreign and anti-shogunate sentiment. The shogun, who was supposed to be the barbarian subduing generalissimo, had failed to subdue the barbarians. In fact, he'd invited them in for tea and trade deals. A powerful movement known as Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian, gained traction, particularly among younger, more radical samurai from powerful Tozama domains like Satsuma and Choshu in western Japan, domains that had always harbored some resentment towards Tokugawa rule. These samurai saw the shogunate as weak and ineffective, and they looked to the long marginalized emperor in Kyoto as a symbol of national unity and a potential rallying point for resistance. It was a potent cocktail of nationalism, xenophobia, and political opportunism. A canonical historical fact is that the Meiji Restoration of 1868 was not initially a popular revolution by the masses, but rather a coup d'etat led by a coalition of these reform-minded samurai, primarily from Satsuma and Choshu, along with some court nobles. They restored the Emperor Meiji, a teenager at the time, to direct imperial rule, effectively abolishing the Tokugawa shogunate. The last Tokugawa shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, realizing the futility of further resistance, abdicated, bringing an end to over 260 years of Tokugawa rule. There was a brief civil war, the Boshin War, between imperial loyalist forces and those still loyal to the shogunate, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The imperial side, with its more modern weaponry and unified command, prevailed. The new Meiji government, now dominated by these ambitious young samurai-turned-statesmen, embarked on a radical program of modernization and westernization. Their slogan became Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the military. They recognized that to avoid the fate of other Asian nations that had been colonized or dominated by Western powers, Japan needed to rapidly adopt Western technology institutions and military methods. It was a breathtakingly ambitious undertaking to transform a feudal agrarian society into a modern industrial nation-state in a matter of decades. This rapid modernization, however, came at a cost to the samurai class. One by one, their traditional privileges were dismantled. In 1871, the feudal domains Han were abolished and replaced by prefectures under the control of the central government, effectively stripping the daimyo of their lands and political power, though many were given government positions or pensions. Samurai stipends, their primary source of income, were first converted into government bonds and then largely eliminated. Perhaps most symbolically, in 1876, the government issued an edict prohibiting the wearing of swords in public by anyone other than military personnel and police. The two swords, the very emblem of samurai status for centuries, were now a relic of the past. It was the ultimate swords to plowshares moment, only the plowshares were often factory machines or bureaucratic desks. Here's a quirky or off-topic fact related to this period of transition. As Japan rapidly westernized, all sorts of Western fashions and customs became popular, sometimes with amusing results. Men began wearing Western-style suits, often ill-fitting at first, cutting off their samurai top-knots and trying things like beef, previously uncommon due to Buddhist influences and ballroom dancing. Imagine a stern former samurai warrior awkwardly trying to navigate a waltz or figure out how to use a knife and fork. Historians still debate the motivations of the Meiji reformers. Were they primarily driven by patriotic fervor to save Japan from foreign domination, or were they also ambitious individuals seeking to create a new power structure with themselves at the top? The dismantling of the samurai class, to which many of them belonged, was a painful, but in their view, necessary step to create a modern unified nation where status was based on merit and contribution to the state rather than hereditary privilege. Not all samurai accepted these changes passively. There were several samurai rebellions in the 1870s, most famously the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, one of the heroes of the Meiji Restoration, who had become disillusioned with the government's rapid westernization and the plight of the samurai. These rebellions, though fought bravely, were ultimately crushed by the new Imperial Japanese Army, which was a conscript army composed mainly of peasants armed with modern rifles and artillery. The irony was profound. The samurai, the traditional warrior class, were defeated by an army modelled on Western lines, an army that represented the very future they were resisting. And so the glorious history of the ancient samurai, a story that began in the muddy plains with mounted warriors that saw them rise to rule Japan through shoguns and regents that witnessed their cultural flourishing and their brutal civil wars, came to a formal institutional end. Their swords were laid aside, their privileges revoked, their very identity transformed. They did not simply vanish, of course. Many former samurai adapted, becoming officers in the new army, government officials, educators, businessmen, and leaders in various fields. Their legacy, Their values of discipline, loyalty, and honor continued to influence Japanese society in profound ways. But the samurai as a distinct sword-wielding feudal class was no more. The mists of time were closing in on their ancient way of life, replaced by the smoke of factories and the dawn of a new, modern Japan. And so our long, meandering journey through the often sleepy, sometimes surprisingly eventful history of Japan's ancient samurai draws to a close. We've trudged through the early mists with those first mounted warriors, marveled at the delicate poetry and emerging steel of the Heian period, and felt the earth tremble during the clash of the Taira and Minamoto. We've navigated the bureaucratic maze of the Kamakura shogunate, weathered the divine winds alongside the Hojo regents, and witnessed the emperor's brief, hopeful return, only to see it dissolve into the artistic but unstable Ashikaga era. The chaos of the Onin War then plunged us into the relentless ambition of the Sengoku Jidai, where warlords carved up the land until the formidable Oda Nobunaga began to hammer it back together, a task completed by the remarkable Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The decisive showdown at Sekigahara paved the way for Tokugawa Ieyasu to usher in centuries of peace, a peace so profound that it eventually rendered the samurai's primary function almost obsolete, leading them from battlefield glory to bureaucratic routine, and finally to the dismantling of their class in the face of a rapidly modernizing world. Their story is a vast tapestry woven with threads of courage and cruelty, loyalty and betrayal, exquisite artistry and brutal warfare. It's a reminder that history is rarely simple, and even the most glorious eras are filled with complex, often contradictory human beings trying to make their way in a changing world. The samurai as a distinct class may have faded into the annals of history, their swords now resting in museums rather than at their sides, but their legacy, their spirit continues to echo a faint, rustling sound in the quiet of the night. Perhaps now, as their long story concludes, you too can find a moment of peace, a gentle drift into slumber, leaving the clash of ancient steel and the whispers of bygone eras behind.
End of script. Good night.